Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Ask Me Anything session. My name is Christina Wood, Director of Start and Scale Programs at Communitech, and I'm thrilled to have three panelists joining me today for a look at implications of working from anywhere. First, we have Louise Kelly, a partner at Deloitte, who will speak to us about tax implications, Nina Gupta, a partner at Gowling, to speak to us about legal implications, and Sandeep Anand, Senior Lead Global Operations and Mobility at Shopify, to really give us a look at how Shopify is dealing with the implications of work from home. Before I turn it over to the group to further introduce themselves, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping items. So just a reminder that today's session is being recorded. We use these sessions as a resource to help our companies with these topics at a later date. And so you can find all of our recordings at communitech.ca. I ask that you keep your microphone on mute during today's session. Please use the chat functionality to ask any questions that you have. We do welcome and encourage you to ask questions throughout each panelist's speaking points, and so they can respond as needed. If you'd like to connect with any of our panelists after today's session, please reach out to your Communitech advisor or CSM, and they can do an introduction for you. We're not able to answer any specific tax or legal questions today. It's really just general guidelines that we can provide. Lastly, please check out Your Week in Tech or our Startup and Scale Up newsletters for a list of all of our upcoming AMA sessions. And with that, I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today and turn it over to Louise to kick us off.
Great, thanks, Christina. So my name is Louise Kelly, and I'm an international tax partner with Deloitte in Ireland. I assist companies that are setting up operations in Europe, particularly in Ireland. And I spent some time working overseas myself, so kind of personally familiar with some of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. So I'm going to cover some of the tax issues that need to be considered when employees are working in various jurisdictions. These include corporate tax issues, employment tax issues, as well as transfer pricing and availability of incentives. And so I'm going to cover a few different situations that can arise with remote working or working from anywhere. So it could be that an employee is just working from home in the country where they're employed. And obviously, a lot of people have been doing that kind of this year, given COVID restrictions. Or secondly, it could be where the person is working in a different country from where they're employed, but I suppose it's on a temporary basis. So maybe due to COVID restrictions, they either have been stuck in a particular country or have chosen maybe to move to a particular country on a temporary basis. And then thirdly, there's a situation where employees are going to be working in a different jurisdiction on a longer term basis. So they're not going to be based, I suppose, in their kind of home country of employment. When we look at the first scenario, so where an individual is working remotely in the country in which they're employed, often there are no additional tax considerations. Obviously, I think in Canada, where there's different provinces, or in the US, where there's obviously different states, that can give rise to some additional tax considerations if people are working, I suppose, outside of their state or province. But I suppose for a lot of countries, particularly in Europe, if you're just working, I suppose, in a different area within that country, generally that does not create any additional tax considerations for the employing company, or indeed for the individual, in terms of additional personal tax or employment taxes. In the second scenario, so where you have somebody spending some time maybe on a temporary basis in a different country, then I suppose that there are a couple of tax risks that do need to be considered. One, I suppose, is the risk, I suppose, that the individual working in a particular country, say if we were to say France, that they could create a taxable presence for the employing company. So if it was a Canadian company that had somebody spending time in France, could, I suppose, the Canadian company end up with a taxable presence in France because of the fact that the individual is spending some time working in France. And that could then give rise to the requirement for the Canadian company to have to register for corporate taxes in France and maybe pay some French corporation tax. Also, I suppose there could be a need for the Canadian company to register for employment taxes in France in relation to the salary that's being paid to the individual, and also considering whether there's any additional social security considerations from a French perspective. I suppose given that a lot of individuals may have been disrupted because of COVID travel restrictions, some countries did release some guidance and effectively some concessions where they would kind of ignore, I suppose, the time that was being spent by individuals in a particular country. So, for example, Irish Revenue had published guidance earlier this year that said that if somebody was spending time in Ireland but normally would not be in Ireland, but because of kind of COVID and travel restrictions, or was spending that time in Ireland, they would not treat that person, I suppose, as being kind of working in Ireland, and therefore wouldn't seek to have additional employment taxes, or there wouldn't be a risk of creating a taxable presence in Ireland by virtue of that individual working from here. I suppose, unfortunately, not all countries or tax authorities have kind of issued similar guidance. So, say, for example, France has given a concession around say the employment tax, so they wouldn't seek maybe employment taxes if an individual is spending time in France and normally wouldn't be there only for COVID, but they haven't given a similar concession or guidance in terms of the creation of a corporate taxable presence. So I think, I suppose, it remains to be seen how aggressive tax authorities are going to be around this. So whether, when it comes to next year, and if they become aware that a company had an individual or more than one individual working in their country, will they kind of seek to try and tax from a payroll tax perspective and from a corporate tax perspective, or will they kind of give a bit of leeway given us was the unprecedented times that we're in? But I suppose, to the extent that that temporary situation was to become a more permanent one, then I think certainly we wouldn't expect the tax authorities to continue to give that kind of a concession, or to kind of look the other way in terms of whether there's tax issues to be managed in that particular country. But I suppose I'm going to spend some more time, I suppose, on the third area where it is a longer term play. So, either what was originally maybe a temporary situation, so where an individual was, maybe originally maybe visiting family in a particular country, and then, ended up kind of having to stay there because of travel restrictions. And then they realized, well, actually, they would like to permanently be based, I suppose, in that foreign country. So I want to kind of spend a little bit of time, talking about some of the issues that that can be created. So whether it's, as I said, an extension of spending kind of a temporary time in COVID, or it could be that from a strategic perspective, the company wants to have individuals based in different countries, maybe to try and develop the market, or because of this was the need to access a greater talent pool, whether that's new employees or to facilitate, I suppose, some really good employees that have requested to spend time overseas. Then there are some tax issues, I suppose, that do need to be considered. So, if an employee is going to be permanently based, or will certainly be based, I suppose, for 12 months or more in a particular country, then certainly there's a risk that they're going to create a taxable presence, or kind of permanent establishment, or PE as we call it, for that employing company. And I suppose a few things that will determine if there is a taxable presence created or not is, is it a fixed place of business? So if somebody is working from their home in a particular country, then some countries will still treat that as being kind of a fixed place of business of the employing company. Others may have a more relaxed approach where it's a working from home scenario, but this was that will vary country by country. And I suppose the other test is, are they kind of a dependent agent? So say if you had a salesperson, for example, and they were concluding contracts, or certainly kind of I suppose engaging with customers in that particular country, then that could create a taxable presence in the foreign jurisdiction. And I suppose what's meant by that, or what are the consequences? And that's really, I suppose, that you would expect the employing company to then register for corporation tax in the foreign jurisdiction. and then they would need to calculate whatever profit should be attributable to that kind of branch or taxable presence. If you had, for example, one person in the country, it might be the case then that it's maybe just some margin on their salary or other associated costs. So the level of profit that could be attributed to the foreign taxable presence could actually be quite low, because it might be a 5% or 10% kind of margin on the salary cost. But I suppose what often is the issue is actually the kind of administration or the compliance that's associated with that. Because if you had 10 employees across 10 different countries, then you're looking at actually potentially having to manage 10 additional corporate tax filings, and obviously there's cost associated with kind of meeting those filing requirements. So that the tax that might end up being paid in various countries could actually be quite small compared to the additional time, either by the in-house team, or I suppose by having to maybe seek a service provider to help manage some of those compliance requirements. So that's certainly kind of one of the issues to manage. The other is that having an employee in another jurisdiction could obviously create the requirement for the employing company to have to register for employment taxes or payroll taxes and social security in the foreign jurisdiction. And I suppose one of the things to also think about is whether the level of personal taxes could be higher or lower in the foreign jurisdiction compared to the home kind of employing country. And I suppose if in a situation where you're recruiting somebody overseas, that probably isn't much of an issue, because if they've been based in a country already, then they're probably familiar with the level of personal tax in that country. But I suppose if you had a person that was working in Canada and then wanted to spend time abroad, and if it was the personal tax burden in the foreign jurisdiction was higher, say maybe than the Canadian personal taxes, the question is then, would the person expect to be kind of made good or made whole for the additional tax burden? So that's something that kind of does need to be discussed and agreed up front. I think in practice, if the request was at the employee's side, where they were asking to spend time abroad, I don't think many companies in that case would kind of take on an additional cost or tax cost associated with maybe additional personal taxes in the foreign jurisdiction. If obviously the person is being kind of sent on a secondment type arrangement, then that's obviously different. And there may be scope for the company to want to take the burden in that particular case. But it is something that should be kind of discussed and agreed upfront, rather than, I suppose, the individual maybe getting a surprise, and potentially a nasty surprise, when they realize that they actually are paying more personal taxes in the foreign jurisdiction compared to what they were used to back in Canada or wherever their kind of home employer country had been. One of the other areas, I suppose, that can be impacted by people, kind of working in different countries compared to maybe kind of what the original setup was, is the area of transfer pricing. And often, I suppose, if it's a case that that they had been traditionally maybe in Canada, and then they go to work in other jurisdictions, the main thing probably to manage in that case is just the level of profits that might need to be attributable to, say, the taxable presence in that foreign jurisdiction. And as I said already, that might be just a small margin on cost. But if I suppose kind of you were having a situation where you kind of wanted to set up maybe a European hub, for example, and a number of Canadian multinationals would have set up kind of these kind of hubs, say in Ireland, and you were planning is to try and take advantage of the Irish corporate tax rate of 12.5%. I suppose some of that would be based on the fact that you would have substance or employees based in Ireland, and therefore that's kind of what supports, I suppose, the ability to be able to claim the 12.5% rate, and also, I suppose, around the I suppose ensuring that Ireland was where the profits were kind of accumulated. If you then had kind of individuals maybe based in other countries, I suppose the potential for the tax advantage from using Ireland, may not, I suppose, be able to be supported. So that's just something, I suppose, to manage, which may not be, I suppose, a particular issue maybe at a real startup stage, but particularly as you may grow and kind of try and set up your structure maybe in a more tax efficient way, is something that does need to be managed if you end up with individuals spending time in various countries. So appreciate, I suppose I've kind of gone through a number of different things there. Obviously, happy kind of to deal with kind of questions later on. I think I just want to flag that, as was, there are complexities here, and it's not just as easy as the person getting on a plane and working in a different country. Unfortunately, there are some kind of compliance issues associated with the tax considerations. Companies can take different approaches and different kind of risk levels, particularly maybe in a startup situation. But I suppose it is important to be kind of mindful that these are things that do need to be managed, particularly as you grow, because you don't want suddenly to have a situation where you have maybe a number of individuals in a country, and I suppose some of these compliance or tax matters haven't been dealt with kind of from the outset. So as I said, happy to take kind of questions later on, but maybe passing over to Nina at this stage.
Before we move on, Louise, just a question. You mentioned about, short term versus long term, and I heard you throw out about 12 months as being maybe a figure. Is there a short term amount where companies can, maybe leave things as are and not have any?
Yeah. So often, I suppose, within kind of treaties and that, often it's maybe a 6-month mark is kind of what's set out in terms of, generally over that you risk triggering maybe personal tax residence, as well as a permanent establishment for corporate tax purposes. So 6 months is probably, kind of the tipping point. I suppose 12 months was more that, companies may take certain kind of, attitudes to risk, and I suppose, the likelihood maybe of detection, and I suppose the attitude of tax authorities, may flip, I suppose, if it becomes more a permanent issue.
Okay, thank you. If there's any other questions for Louise, we have one here. Would that be 6 months concurrently?
So there's kind of different ones. Sometimes kind of say if you're looking more at the kind of the tech world, it probably isn't, like if you had it maybe within a calendar year, that could kind of trigger, I suppose, kind of personal tax residence. If it was very much, I suppose, start and wasn't linked maybe to kind of particular projects or that, there may be some scope, to try and separate it, but certainly within a calendar year, you're probably somewhat at risk.
Okay, thank you. We'll turn it over to Nina to share her perspective from the legal side.
So thanks, everyone. My name is Nina Gupta, and I'm a partner at Gowling WLG, and I'm actually in my office in Kitchener, Ontario, because I'm one of the people that actually like working from my office, and since we're an essential service, we're allowed to work from our place of business, which for me is a treat. Who would have thought coming to the office would be considered to be a treat? But we're talking about the opposite of that. We're talking about working from away. Now, I'm going to do away in concentric circles. So the first away is a home that is in the same tax jurisdiction as the business is located. So Ontario for most of the people who are on this call. The second circle is somewhere in Canada, but not Ontario. And then the third circle is really, foreign jurisdictions, possibly the United States, which is very popular. And then the fourth circle is really far away, which is perhaps places like India, Pakistan, or perhaps some of these countries that are offering wonderful permits for people to work by the beach. I had started doing a slideshow, and I actually had one of these work from away ads from, I think it was the Bahamas, as one of my slides. So I have fantasies about working from away as well. So let's just take the easiest one, which is working from home in the same tax jurisdiction. So in general, you don't have a lot of tax issues if you're in the same tax jurisdiction because the remittances are the same, the CPP and the EI would be the same. You have a couple of interesting issues when people work from home. One is whether or not the employee's liability insurance would actually cover loss to contents and equipment that is in their home, working from home, or whether your liability insurance, the company's liability insurance, will cover that. So that's one thing that you might want to think about, the insurance aspect. The second issue is what I call the whole area of locking down confidentiality. I am consistently surprised by people at Starbucks when we used to go to Starbucks doing what I can tell as I'm in the lineup for my latte, doing highly confidential things on what is essentially public Wi-Fi, and those are at risk. So what policies are you going to create and what technical measures are you going to implement to maintain the confidentiality of the work product and the information that they can access? The third issue when people are working from home, and maybe Sandeep will have some great ideas, is the reality is some people are more productive at home, but many people are not. And in the COVID-19 era, many businesses have had to go to work from home models. And people are struggling, and I'm just reading an email now from a colleague of having 3 kids, 2 dogs, and 1 guinea pig, as well as 2 working professionals in the same home. And quite frankly, that sounds like positively like hell to me. And so I drive over to the office, but not everybody can do that. And so productivity goes down. So how do you manage your expectations around productivity when people are really struggling with huge barriers to productivity? And I know Sandeep is probably going to deal with this more, but mental health is truly a huge issue. I spend, somebody actually asked me, we keep track of our non-billable hours in our office as well, our management hours, and my management hours have gone up. And one of the reasons my management hours have gone up is I'm spending a lot more time one-on-one with people who are truly struggling at all levels of the organization, including very senior levels of the organization. And so what are we going to do when people are working from home and have to work from home or want to work from home and have those mental health issues? So that's kind of your first circle. We haven't triggered any Louise Kelly tax issues, but we have some practical issues. I noticed, Christina, that somebody asked about WSIB and working from home. If you are a WSIB employer, then you will have to pay WSIB for that employee who is temporarily working from home. It may even be for permanently working from home because WSIB is assessed on an enterprise basis. What does the enterprise do and what is the rate for that enterprise? There are some COVID-19 relief programs that may apply to your business if you are a WSIB employer, but you don't get a break just because somebody's working from home temporarily or permanently. Interestingly, and this may be of shock to you, WSIB may cover something like a slip and fall if somebody has a slip and fall at home. We don't know, and it depends on the specific facts of that injury or accident. And so you would just put in your Form 7, the employee would put in their medical form, and the WSIB will adjudicate whether it is covered or not. So I just want to make sure we answered questions that were asked in the pre-session. What if we're actually going to another provincial jurisdiction, but the person's still reporting into Ontario? And typically in Canada, if it's really intended to be a temporary COVID-19 measure, then you are going to still pay all the Ontario taxes, the employer health tax in Ontario. Things become more dicey when a person says, look, I'd like to permanently move to BC and I'd like to work permanently from BC, and I'm going to remain in BC, and my end of year tax jurisdiction from henceforth will be British Columbia, then I could see you having an obligation to remit and withhold BC taxes. You need to talk to your tax accountant about what is the right way to code that employee so you don't have, neither you nor your employee have an unfavorable tax issue or complication come tax time, because we don't need any more stress than we already have these days. The most difficult issue is when people are trying to go to what I call the United States. And I say the United States because let's be honest, even with the closed border, it is still our biggest trading partner, and we have many connections. And I know there was a question from somebody who wants to work from the US because her spouse is there, and that would be really convenient. Please talk to the immigration lawyer of your choice. We have some immigration lawyers, there's some really good ones locally, and tax lawyers. Why? The US has some of the toughest immigration rules and visa and work permit rules in the world. And one of the things that Canada allows is something called dual purpose. So you can come to Canada as a visitor, as well as somebody who ultimately intends to apply for permanent residency. So you can come on a work permit, you can then apply for permanent residency, and that's perfectly acceptable. Canadian authorities understand you may have many different purposes when you come to a country. The US gets suspicious if you have multiple purposes. So if you go and visit in the US to be with your husband, and then they catch wind of the fact that you're actually working in the US, albeit for a Canadian company, they then will start looking at whether or not you lied to them about your purpose and whether or not you owe and have paid US taxes. So never go into the US for anything more than what I would say is a short vacation time. If you go 2 weeks for something, the good old days we went to Disney with our kids and I worked and the kids play, that they don't care about. But if you're going to go for anything longer than a couple of months, you really want to talk about whether or not this is going to hamper your long-term plans in terms of getting, whether that is a green card or some kind of visa to stay in the States. So that's a visa issue. I want to talk a few things about, sometimes it's really hard to change plans. So people, we have a couple of people I know who've gone to India because of COVID-19, family issues, want to take care of a sick parent. Now they want to live there and work remotely. It's actually working really well. And I have found that there's really two silos or two streams. One is, this is working fine, as long as they're willing to put up with the fact that, we're 10.5 hours different from India and we can figure out a compromise. They can work from India for as long as they want. Then there's some HR issues that Sandeep will address about, well, what's compensation? Because they're now no longer a local Canadian employee. They are now an Indian employee, and are they really going to be willing to work at what we would typically pay a foreigner, a foreign employee in India? And if you're going to do any of these, I have to give a shout out to our sponsor of today, Communitech Outreach, which is effectively a professional employer organization. So if you're going to hire somebody in a foreign jurisdiction, even if it was a former Canadian employee and they're now becoming an Indian or a Pakistani or a Bahamian or a French or Irish employee, these organizations can become the employer of record vis-a-vis the government, pay all the appropriate taxes and remittances, and can actually help you stay compliant. So shout out to Christina Wood and Communitech Outreach if you think you're going to do that. And these are important ways of remaining compliant, because it's a pain. I'm telling you, the amount of hours you will spend to try to be compliant with Canadian law, let alone all the other laws, is going to essentially dwarf the cost of going through a PEO, or professional employer organization. But let's take that example of somebody who wants to permanently or semi-permanently move somewhere. Some of my clients are saying this is working just fine. Others of my clients are saying, I'll put up with it during COVID-19 because it's COVID and it's 2020. But as soon as we can get back together, I want my team back together, at least partially, at least twice a week, at least once a month. I want them in this jurisdiction. And so how are you going to deal with that? And I say you should have a written employment agreement if you're going to have a significant change like this, where people are going to be jurisdictionally away, that is crystal clear about the fact that we can recall them when we want to, how much notice that we are going to give them to come back, who pays for the return trip, and what happens if they say, I don't want to come back. That beach in the Bahamas is way nicer than, Canada in February, which I have to say, most places are nicer than Canada in February. So, what did they do? I mean, so making it very clear that that would be considered to be a abandonment of employment. So you need to have some pretty frank and, quite frankly, difficult conversations when those arrangements are going to be more than just temporary. And finally, can we just talk about healthcare? Healthcare is really important, and some of the companies here have some kind of group or quasi-group plan. Many of those plans have strict limitation on coverage when people are working from away, so when they're in a different jurisdiction. And so you need to be very cognizant of the fact that you may have an employee who thinks they have, quote, foreign coverage or traveling coverage, and not realize that traveling coverage does not actually cover them when they are semi-permanently in a foreign jurisdiction. And I've had some very unfortunate cases where the cost of healthcare was in the tens of thousands of dollars, and the employee truly thought they were covered, and they were not covered. And so you have to make it very, and the PEOs can also help you find localized health coverage, and these can be bought on 1, 2, 3, 6, or 12-month increments. So it can be done. But the coverage, the local coverage we have as employees in Canada typically does not cover you in a foreign jurisdiction for any length of time. So, and that goes to even things like life insurance, which may be predicated on somebody being in Canada and not going into a risky jurisdiction, and long-term disability insurance also may be predicated on somebody working in Canada as opposed to in my fantasy life, on a beach in the Bahamas. So I hope that that's a good introduction to what I call the checklist of considerations. And of course, if anyone has specific questions, happy to take them up later.
Thanks, Nina. We'll turn it over to Sandeep to speak about how to put all of this into practice.
Hey everyone, super excited to be here and shout out to a few faces and names here I'm seeing that I haven't seen in a while. So hello again. Yeah, so easy, right? Probably not. So I'm going to take a more practical standpoint today and share Shopify's story because it's been a bit of a monumental year, I think, for all of us. And I think those deep into this profession probably a little bit more because, well, as you know, it was 2020 and a lot of things happened that have really changed and pivoted the way I think the world is working, the future of even things like mobility, tax considerations, immigration, policies, and all of those good things. So I guess I'll start with just a brief overview of kind of the story of Shopify and what we saw this year. Happy to say, I think that it's been one of those years where we're able to really take control of what the mobility industry and what our programs can do and go from the doom and gloom group to what I continue to call ourselves the cool factor of a company who, like Shopify, has decided and made the call very early on post-COVID to be remote first and solely focused this year on building a culture and an organization focused on how can we build something that is focused on what was office centricity, now moving on to what the world could be if we were just working from home. So this year, from a personal standpoint, I came back from mat leave in October, and this year, the year was not supposed to go the way that it was, I'm sure, as for everybody. And the focus for us was going into this year looking at the settlement and the experience of our employees who we move. And so the mandate for my team, focusing solely on mobility, was looking at the various programs like relocation, assignments, immigration. We do see we do oversee tax and immigration compliance as well. This quickly shifted with COVID, and a lot of things that we had planned obviously went out the door, and all of a sudden we're building for what can we do? How do we quickly hire? And much like other tech companies, very much focused on continuing to hire and just moving quickly. And so quickly, my team started thinking of different ways we could do this. So it truly, from the essence, changed the world of what mobility would look like. For us, it was work from home first. So now all of a sudden for mobility, we were looking at, well, what does that mean for relocation? So we had to quickly pivot, and especially for the support of our talent acquisition and VP teams, is provide a framework to look at what does relocation even mean now? Of course, I think for those in mobility are probably sitting there thinking, do we still have a job? Are people still gonna move? What does it look like? And we quickly pivoted away from that and actually thought about what an awesome opportunity to build something more unique and look at things in a more global scale. And so some of our key things that we looked at when we created our relocation philosophy was number one, time zone. So one of the things I'd say for sure for those who are looking at remote work is what can you actually do in consideration of time zone. And so one of our key things, we're looking at the 3-hour time zone overlap, making sure that there are at least 4 hours of key hours of work overlapping with the core team. The second piece was where are they actually located? And so the question of the year is how can we hire them? Top down from our executive team, the mandate for my team and the working group that is targeted on enabling work from home is we're not going to just say work from anywhere in Canada or North America. Toby, I work from anywhere. And we were like, almost anywhere? He's like, work from anywhere. So we were shooting big. So lots of pressure for the team, but that ties in well to what Louise and Nina focused on, which is essentially how do you build the back end infrastructure to actually make it happen? And then, of course, the 24 to 48 hours after we announced going remote officially in May was mostly myself and my team looking at many Slack messages saying, well, I'm going to just grab my camper van and I'm going all over Canada, crossing borders, doing our thing. And of course, we're holding our breath thinking, how are we going to manage this? And so one of the things I challenged the teams to think about was, now that we've announced it, let's embrace it. And yes, we're panicked. Yes, it's quite like stressful, but let's think about how we can embrace this new world and get ahead of the chaos. And so that's one of the things I was going to share with the group is just what can your company do and what is the risk tolerance and what is the appetite to create and be innovative. And so for us, what that meant was, what can we do to enable our employees within a framework to actually request working temporarily from different locations? And so to Nina's points, there's different circles of abilities to do it within the country, within the province, and then international. And so we're lucky because we did have targeted groups focusing on each aspect of remote. And so my team focused on the back-end infrastructure. So working very closely with folks like Louise and Nina, so tax experts, legal employment experts, payroll experts, data security, physical security, all coming together to think about what can we build. And so with this, the other piece I was going to say is, depending on the vision for your company, for us, of course, emotionally a little bit tough to think we'll never go back to the office, especially loving where I work and the people that we work with. But knowing that we had this directive, it really helped us just focus on getting it done. And so knowing that the long-term goal is to build something permanent, quote unquote, we'll see in a year or two how things play out, but for the moment, it is remote first. Think about the technology piece. And so Shopify has been the only organization where I've been able to really capitalize on the Workday aspect of it. And so working with our killer team, we were able to actually build in certain request processes and workflows into the technology. And so all of those people who are individually reaching out to my team, to the business partners, to their leads, we created a workflow within Workday. So anyone who was requesting to move either temporarily or permanently to a different location had a way to get it out of their system, put in the request, and then gave us the opportunity to build in the right approval flow to make sure that every person who needed to be looped in could be looped in. And so for us, the key folks, in addition to obviously corporate payroll tax, as well as employment, our legal team, benefits, we've got our compensation team, and we've also got the mobility team looking at the how to make sure that we're actually hiring them legally and in a compliant way. And no one at work cares about those two words, compliant or risk, but that's something that we're mandated with. And so we built in that process where the teams actually have the opportunity to look through it. So that's something that worked really well. The other big bucket for us was looking at the different hiring strategies. And so working really quick and being the company who wants to grow and not really be inhibited by this, we were looking at 3 different hiring strategies. So Nina touched on this a little bit earlier, but looking at where do we have entities? Easy peasy, go ahead and hire. You've got your employment contract, hopefully your benefits plan, your payroll set up, everything's good to go. And then how do we then hire folks who are now at a company like Shopify where we've said work from anywhere? How can we support that hiring strategy? So that's where we looked at organizations similar to Outpost, the PEO approach, looking at these partners in higher risk countries such as Brazil and France, where employment law is really high, the tax scheme is quite aggressive. You just don't want to mess in those, you don't want to mess up anything in those locations. So partner with the key folks. And so we've been working with a PEO company right now. And then the third piece is looking at the contractor and consultant method. I'd say that for sure is something that needs to have a lot of due diligence done with it, because the risk there is quite high. Something I'm sure that Nina could touch on a bit more, but the concept of misrepresentation is quite high. You never want to be the company who is trying to use the consultant or contraction kind of contractual agreement as a way where it seems like you're misrepresenting the type of hire that there is. And then looking at the global nuances. Where do you owe pension? Where do you owe severance? If you're a company that offers equity, what does that look like? How can you offer it? Is it RSU? Is it cash settled? Is it options? Just to name a few. So that's kind of been the biggest thing. Right now we're looking at entity setup. So global growth has also been a big piece for us. So really digging deep into the research of each of our locations of interest, trying to see where our talent is, and then looking at building the entities there. So I know that's a lot of information. I'm probably going to just switch to make this more conversational so we can get into some of the key questions. But I think to summarize it all, I'd say crazy year, definitely one for the books for all of us. But I think that's a great opportunity to really shift what is global and what is mobility for your organization, and how can you make some of these new and really cool things happen. And to me, all of this kind of fits nicely into also the way that you could attract and retain employees. To Nina's point, who doesn't want to go work in Bahamas and work in these amazing locations? And on that front, with these digital nomad visas, try to embrace it and create something around it so that we can actually have our employees go in and enjoy it as a bit of a perk as part of your company, keeping obviously in mind the tax and payroll and legal risks around it. But there's a pivotal shift in the way we're able to work. And I think it's something that each of us can really get our hands onto and create something new for what 2020 and beyond may look like.
Thank you for that, Sandeep. I'm wondering if you could also touch on some of the pros or cons around managing performance from work from home.
100%. So one of the pieces, and there's so many parts of this I may have probably missed, but this is where education and the intentional performance management definitely is key. So my team has done a lot of work in creating frameworks for what the strategy or the policy might look like, but we've partnered really closely with our business partner teams as well, just to make sure that we're doing the proper training for leads. And more importantly, I think the employee base. So just because we've created programs or have enabled this work from anywhere, time zone, like I mentioned, is a factor. And you might be going on a trip where you're working, but it's on a beach. But the key piece there is you're still working. And so as soon as you're not doing that, we're going to have a problem. And so how do we manage those things? And then also the bigger thing here is just making sure everyone's on the same page, understanding what that looks like. Internet, more important than ever. So as silly as it sounds, we're reminding people that you actually need to have proper internet in order to make sure you do work. Costa Rica, for example, fantastic place to go work. From what I hear, not so great on the internet front. So before you start approving people to go these locations, it needs to be a holistic conversation, and all of it kind of ties back down to performance management.
If I could say, it's not just Costa Rica, it's also surprisingly any place outside of an urban area in Canada. I have moved to a lovely farm just north of Guelph. I am 5 minutes from Walmart and Canadian Tire, and I don't have fiber. And so, you know, if the weather is bad, I unfortunately have bad internet. Another reason why I like working from the office. Can I pick up something that Sandeep mentioned, which is the contractor comment? Because I think, Christina, we even had a question. Why don't we just make them contractors, pay them into their bank account, and let them worry about their compliance? And while I don't want to sort of suggest what other jurisdictions will do, I do know that in Canada, they use what I call the duck test. And if a person looks, quacks, and waddles like a duck, they're a duck. And what I mean by that is an employee is working full-time and near full-time for you, doesn't have a lot of other clients, you know, it doesn't have their own shingle out, doesn't have, you know, like they are an employee. And so a disguised employee exposes you not just to the risks I talked about and Louise talked about earlier. You're now non-compliant. And when you're non-compliant, you expose yourself to fines and penalties. And the other thing that you expose yourself to is you probably thought you were escaping certain withholding, remittances, deductions, premiums, and you're going to have to pay them with interest and fines. And you probably didn't budget for that. And you probably didn't manage the termination risk properly, because contractors, as you may know, have different rights on termination than employees. So it's not, I'm a real believer, be honest. If they're employees, figure out how you're going to make this work as employees. Now, if they're truly contractors because they have their own business, that's a different issue. But most of the times when I get asked, oh, they're really a contractor, don't worry about it, Nina, is that they're a disguised employee. So I just wanted to deal with that a little bit more fulsomely, because I know we had some questions before the session about why don't we just make them all contractors? And what that person is asking sincerely is that okay? It's not okay. Some people believe that they're less likely to get caught, but I don't believe they actually avoid the risk. So, you know, you can play compliance roulette every, day of your life. As a lawyer, that's not something lawyers are comfortable with. And I did want to shout out, I know, Christina, you said that comments will not be available on the replay, but a great comment from Azar Janjua, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, where it mentioned that sometimes when you have all these contractors, that can actually negatively affect your company valuation when looking to raise or borrow money, which is a larger question, but great comment from the audience.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nina. I also turned to the chat to go over a couple of the questions that have been sitting there. So the first one is really around taxes within Canada. So for an Ontario company with an employee who lives in Quebec, is it mandatory to remit Quebec taxes? And does it matter if the employee is significant shareholder or founder of the company?
My belief is that you are more likely than not going to be required to pay, remit and pay Quebec taxes, and you may be in the unfortunate position where you may have to pay employer health tax in Ontario, as well as pay the Quebec remittances, QPP, which is the Quebec pension plan. So you should get your accountant to work that out, and the fact that they are the founder shareholder actually increases your risk and does not decrease your risk. Of course, if you're just paying somebody qua shareholder as a dividend, you may have different questions completely.
Thank you for that. There's also a question here from Alex. What is an employee's duty to inform us, I'm assuming they mean leadership or owners, about their travels? If we are unaware of exposure, but then get hit by a notice from a foreign jurisdiction, do we have any recourse?
Oh, so let me answer that and let Louise sort of jump in because it's a tax issue. I've been practicing for 32 years, and I have to tell you, it's rare that an employer doesn't know that somebody's off on a frolic on the Bahamas or Pakistan or England or France. It can happen in these days, but it's rare. In these COVID-19 times, I suppose when you're not really seeing people frequently, the risk is a bit exacerbated. But I'm going to just tell you practically, what are you going to do? So you get hit with this huge audit, trail, and it's going to cost you gazillions of dollars, and you're going to go after your employee. Good luck collecting, So that's why it's good to have the kinds of policies and protocols that Sandeep was talking about to mitigate against those kinds of, unintended consequences.
Yeah, I agree, and I think I suppose there is a need, I think, kind of for leadership to proactively try and manage the issue, because obviously, given COVID and the kind of increased prevalence of people potentially being overseas, there is a need, I think, for companies to be proactive around it, so that they become aware, I suppose, to the extent that employees are working, I suppose, in another jurisdiction. Some groups and companies that had announced maybe earlier in the year that people could work, kind of from anywhere, I suppose, have since I suppose, watered it down a little bit and saying, well, you can work from anywhere within your kind of home country, or you can work from anywhere as long as we have an entity in that country. So they've been trying to manage it. I think, as Sandeep had said, I think Shopify have been, trying to kind of continue to live the message that came out, where other groups have probably rode back a little bit as they've kind of tried to manage some of the issues. So, a number of clients that we kind of work with have been trying to proactively determine, I suppose, where our individuals actually currently, and that's kind of, I suppose, reaching out and asking people, I suppose, to let them know if they're no longer in Ireland or France or Canada or wherever they're supposed to be working.
Yeah, I would just add, like, again, from a practical standpoint, tracking employees has become such a core part of our team quite regularly, just because, to Nina's point, there are instances now where, because of COVID and, they're innocent and most times, where people don't realize that they're going to cause any sort of legal or tax risk to the company or to themselves. Because let's be real, when you cross a border, you don't have the proper permits, it's your record that is also getting red flagged. But we do that as part of our regular workflow now, where one of my team members is trying to stay on top of where folks are. Happy to take it offline in terms of what specifically we do to get ahead of it. But that was also the thinking around building the foundation and the technology, so that we could pull reports, see who's been approved for what length, and then actually, AKA, like, in other words, police them, but essentially police them and make sure that they're actually coming back. Just because we, as much as flexibility we want to give, we are no tolerance when it comes to things like that, because the risk just isn't worth it.
Thank you. We do have another question here in the chat. And we may have already touched on it earlier when Louise was speaking, but their question is regarding temporary work from anywhere that is international. So we are post-COVID wanting to be flexible, and my understanding is that there are often withholding tax requirements on the employer depending on the country. Is there a typical duration that would most often trigger this? For example, 30 days, 60 days, or longer. So I think we talked about 6 months kind of being the max.
Yes, so that tends to be probably more where, I suppose, the employee could potentially become, I suppose, resident in the jurisdiction, and probably on the corporate kind of permanent establishment piece. The person, Karen, is right in terms of sometimes the threshold is supposed to trigger kind of payroll withholding can be lower than that. I don't think there's kind of a standard. It does vary country by country. So even, say, for example, in Ireland, you kind of tend to look at, well, what exactly is the individual doing? So it could be that the functions that they're performing may be such that they might be able to spend kind of up to 60 days. Also, sometimes what's necessary to consider is if you've been in the country maybe in the prior year, and you might need to kind of accumulate days, because sometimes the test isn't just in a single year, but you need to look at maybe over a 2-year period. So unfortunately, there isn't kind of a standard or kind of answer. It tends to vary country by country, and then you do need to maybe take more than just a particular trip into consideration when you look at whether that threshold is breached or not.
The other thing, just to add to that, is there's also like, something is better than nothing. So it doesn't mean you need to give employees the full 180 or 90 or 60 or 30. I think something is better than nothing. So what is your company's risk tolerance, and what does that mean? And have a list of approved locations. Think to what the security measures or the regulatory risks or the corporate tax risks or whatever the case is. Think about what's most important for your employee base, build it around the risks and considerations, and maybe have a list of approved locations. And that could kind of help give some employees the opportunity to do the travel and work from anywhere. Although I'm sure, again, people are going to be looking at the Cayman Islands and Bahamas and all of those places. But to my point again, I think something's better than nothing at this point.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left. So to the audience, if there's any burning questions that we haven't yet touched on that you were hoping to get out of today's session, please put them into the chat and we'll do our best to get to them. Or like I said, the panelists are all willing to speak after the call. If you connect with your Communitech CSM or advisor, we can definitely do an introduction for you. Nina, one other question around employee contracts. If an employee changes locations or jurisdictions, is a new employment contract required?
So not always, but what you have to look at is to what extent, and this requires a bit of an analysis of to what extent the presence of your employee in another country will trigger that country's employment regime. Employment law is considered to be a matter of public policy in many countries, in many courts, and so you can't contract out. So for example, the laws in France are extremely protective of employees. And while some of us may have fantasies of, doing our work in Paris, as employers, we may be concerned about the protections that the French laws give the employee, and so we might want to have a new agreement. In other cases, if they're moving from Ontario to BC, it might just be a one-page amendment to be clear about some certain things like hours of work, which was mentioned by Sandeep, the fact that tax remittances will now be BC tax remittances, and that the laws of BC will now govern. So it's not a full new contract. However, I'm just going to put my employment law hat on. I think anytime you're making a major change, it's a great opportunity to update your contracts. In Ontario in particular, contracts are under attack, especially termination provisions. So this is a great opportunity to fix that while you're fixing all the jurisdictional issues as well. A bit sneaky, but it's a good opportunity to fix your contract.
Thank you for that. So I think we're at just about time. If there's no other questions coming in from the chat, then I'll take this opportunity to once again thank Louise, Nina, and Sandeep all for joining us today. Super informative, great answers to our questions. I know everyone's trying to navigate through what the work from anywhere will look like. So I think this was really, really helpful. Actually, sorry, one other question's just come in. When you are changing jurisdictions, do you also review the salary band and align it to the salary paid in that area?
I think that's a Sandeep question.
Yep. 100%. So I think the companies need to make a strategic decision on how they want to handle this. I think you have options. I know some companies are looking at just doing like one scale depending on where they are, or depending on where they are in terms of higher versus lower cost of living, and then changing it whichever way it needs to go, either higher or actually reducing their pay to a lower scale. So it's aligned to what makes sense for that region.
Okay, thank you for that. So as I was saying, thank you to the panelists. Thank you for the audience. Really appreciate everyone's time today. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you next week for the next Ask Me Anything. Take care, everyone.
Happy holidays, everyone, and stay safe.
Thanks. Bye.